So, Bidisha, a very grim picture that Donald Trump paints there of American foreign policy. And as you pointed out in your initial comment, he's got the terminology right. He chooses his words very carefully. They could be easily understood by his supporters. But did you hear anything about how he would change all of that?
No, that's what's extremely interesting about this. It's certainly true that there is so much to say and to ask about Western intervention in the Middle East, going back as far as Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration and so on and so forth. And every progressive thinker or politician or even human rights writer like me asks those questions. It's also certainly true that we are witnessing not the Third World War, but something we haven't seen before, which is the spread of the development of fragile states and civil breakdown and so on and so forth across the Middle East. But it's very interesting how Trump evades the question of what America should or could do about it. A lot of the criticism has been about when Americans have intervened. Why he brings Hillary Clinton in it is very interesting, because actually it's Barack Obama who's been quite an isolationist president himself. And he uses the word, is it savage killers or savage dangers, which is the absolute red flag Orientalist word to use. So he sets it up again as this very classic Bush term, the axis of evil, meaning here we are in America, civilized, peaceful, peace-loving, which I don't think is true, and then look across the pond, look at what all of these foreigners are doing, these terrorists, as though terrorism is spreading, as though you can't control it. And the underlying message is, don't worry, you people, because if I'm in power, I'm going to, whatever it is, pull up the bridges, pull up the borders, I'm going to gird our country in iron so nothing can get through. And of course, if you don't know a lot about the finer details of Middle Eastern politics, which the majority of all of us don't necessarily, it's extremely anxiety-making, and he's playing on that. You have to also think about the environment in which Trump is saying these things. He's not on a panel of experts. He is sitting there talking to a captive audience, a willing audience. He's egging them on, and they're egging him on. But if you sat down and said to him, well, what would you do about the army? What would you do about global trade? What would you do about fundamentalism? What would you do about multiculturalism? I bet you he doesn't have the answers, because what people like Trump are very good at doing is showboating.
Right, and the other irony about this, Nathan, is that he blames Hillary Clinton for this state of affairs. We didn't hear George Bush's name being mentioned at all. He also had some choice words, Nathan, on Hillary Clinton's domestic policies. Let's watch this.
Big business, elite media, and major donors are lining up behind the campaign of my opponent because they know she will keep our rigged system in place. They are throwing money at her because they have total control over every single thing she does. She is their puppet, and they pull the strings.
So, Nathan, it might be election rhetoric what he's saying, but do you think that a lot of what he says about Hillary Clinton, especially on the issue of Wall Street, is in sync with the average American voter?
It's definitely in sync with the Republican voter. You remember all the pressure for her to release her paid speeches to Goldman Sachs and others. She got a couple of $100,000 for each of those speeches, and she didn't do it. I mean, she's promised to, or maybe hinted that she might, but she hasn't done it. This paints her out to be part of the 1% global elite. Now, coming from a billionaire property developer from Manhattan, that might seem a bit rich, but there's been a real effort here at the Republican convention to paint Donald Trump as somehow a blue-collar billionaire, that he hangs out with carpenters and electricians and bricklayers because he's in the construction business, and he happens to make a lot of money, but really his soul is with the average American worker. Not Hillary Clinton. She's been part of the establishment since she was First Lady, Secretary of State and Senator beforehand from New York, of course, and it taps into the distrust of the Clintons. The Clinton Foundation will be a big talking point in the next few months. And it taps into this whole idea that Donald Trump is not a politician, that he's an outsider. Yet Hillary Clinton is the consummate politician who will say anything to get elected.
Alberto, the Huffington Post had an interesting analysis of the Latino vote and Donald Trump. It says that while conservative Latino voters may just hold their nose and vote for Donald Trump, it has more to do with their dislike of Hillary rather than them liking Donald Trump.
The Latino vote is very simple. It's very difficult to analyze from a conservative perspective, even from a Democrat perspective, because politicians tend to see us as a monolith, as a bloc, and we are extremely sophisticated, and our new generations are arriving, and someday they will vote in larger numbers, and we will see that cultural wars, we will see that the so-called social issues are not key at the time when we go and vote. Clinton is a huge brand with the Hispanic voter. Don't forget that. Yes, there may be some animosity right now with Secretary Clinton, but the Clinton brand was extremely popular before. The Obama as a figure, as a political figure, was able to capture a record number of those votes. And what I'm foreseeing is that the GOP strategy toward Hispanics in America is so dumb, is so absurd, is so bigoted. I mean, it is so ridiculous that the voters are not going to go in the numbers that they need.
Yukon, there was several references to China in the speech. Let's look at another one. And of course, this one again is on the trade and economic relationship. Let's watch this.
We are going to enforce all trade violations against any country that cheats. This includes stopping China's outrageous theft of intellectual property, along with their illegal product dumping and their devastating currency manipulation. They are the greatest that ever came about. They are the greatest currency manipulators ever. Our horrible trade agreements with China and many others will be totally renegotiated. That includes renegotiating NAFTA to get a much better deal for America, and we'll walk away if we don't get that kind of a deal.
So, Yukon, there you have it again. Carefully chosen words, Any country that cheats, theft, currency manipulators. He's got it right down. But really, are these, what is he talking about? Are they really workable, pragmatic policies? How is China looking at this?
Well, you have to realize it's all being cast against the vision he's putting forward. That's the blue-collar worker in America who's suffering. Right. So their incomes are not increasing. They're facing problems with unemployment. The major factors which are causing this, frankly, is technology and productivity increases. It's a global phenomenon. Everywhere, people are suffering from this. But it's much more convenient to think about this being caused by somebody like China, and the trade is the victim. We have to realize the fact that, for example, a lot of the trade, the exports that come into the U.S. from China, which are seen as technologically sophisticated, are actually managed by American companies. And the majority of exports in China are, in fact, U.S.-driven, U.S. marketed. You take Apple, Dell Computers. All these things are actually managed or done, or the technology is being basically used overseas to produce goods for America, and the profits actually accrue to America. So that's a false thing. Currency manipulation, most people realize, isn't really going on. China is not actually manipulating the currency. Its exchange rate has been appreciating dramatically. It's probably needs to go down, but they've actually kept it a little bit up. But if it's been manipulated, it's been manipulating in the opposite direction, preventing it from actually going in values that it should be going, because the markets have changed a lot. So I don't think that's really a serious concern. So both these issues of technology transfer, currency manipulations are really not significant issues. Much more, I think, is the question, what do you do about making America more competitive? And he's mentioned that a little bit, but not a lot. And the answers generally lie in, what do you do about improving the education system here? What do you do about the infrastructure? Huge financing needs. This is what is needed to generate more jobs. This will be the thing that will benefit the blue-collar workers the most. And this is a serious problem. Where are you going to get the money for this? How are you going to do this? Because everyone's been talking about it for the last decade.
Bidisha, another big concern, and we hear this both from the Republicans and the Democrats, and that is countering terrorism. Let's take a listen to what Donald Trump had to say about that, and then I have a question on the back of that. Let's watch this.
We must have the best, absolutely the best gathering of intelligence anywhere in the world. The best. We must abandon the failed policy of nation building and regime change that Hillary Clinton pushed in Iraq, in Libya, in Egypt, and in Syria. Instead, we must work with all of our allies who share our goal of destroying ISIS and stamping out Islamic terrorism, and doing it now, doing it quickly. We're going to win. We're going to win fast. Lastly, and very importantly, we must immediately suspend immigration from any nation that has been compromised by terrorism until such time as proven vetting mechanisms have been put in place. We don't want them in our country.
So there we heard it again, Bidisha, and he's talking about nation building and regime change, blaming Hillary Clinton for it, yet that was the hallmark of the neocons under the Bush administration. And then in the second part of what he said there, he's going to suspend immigration from countries where he suspects terrorists are coming from.
What he said about race and terrorism and immigration, wrapping these things all up together, is actually so inflammatory. I can feel myself getting hot and angry as I'm saying this to you, because it's what very far-right conservatives have always done, which is conflate issues and then bundle them all up together and then use them to play on people's fears. So on the one hand, he's saying, we don't like the way foreign policy has gone in the past. He pins it on Clinton, but it should really be pinned on Bush. So we're going to be much more isolationist. Then he drops in this very subtle warning, which is, I think, that he is going to then empower the NSA to have absolute blanket surveillance. That's what he's talking about. He's saying information gathering. That is a code word. It means we are going to put so much money into monitoring everything that goes on, your phone calls, your emails. And that's a completely separate thing from then saying we want to defeat terrorism, which, believe me, every single country in the world wants to do. More than anything, the countries which have a high ISIS or Daesh or Islamic State presence want to do that more than anything in the world. And then he goes on to a fourth thing, which is, again, unrelated, saying we don't want foreigners, we don't want immigration, we don't want, and then in code words, as it were in parentheses, he doesn't want brown people, he doesn't want Muslims, without realizing, of course, that anyone who is brown, who's Muslim, who's Middle Eastern, whatever you want to call it, if there's a refugee crisis, those people are doing that because they are fleeing terrorism. They do not want that. This is a human rights issue, and he wraps it all up together. So on the one hand, you're going to have America stepping away from military involvement with the rest of the world, becoming militarized in terms of its surveillance within America itself, and then somehow rewriting the narrative of America as being a distinct entity and nothing to do with immigration whatsoever, which, as one of the previous speakers on this program said, is so far from the truth. America is a multicultural, multiracial, immigrant, migrant nation. So it's extremely dangerous, inflammatory what he's doing, and it's also extremely sly, because he seems to be talking about foreign policy, but he's really talking about race and culture, and also about control and surveillance.
Nathan, one final point. We've had the convention, we've had Donald Trump in his speech on Thursday night, and the early polls, somewhat unscientific, show that there's been something of a convention bump for him. But question is, how does Hillary Clinton respond to this? Will she be taking note of what has been said at this convention? I mean, do you think there's any kind of retooling going on in her campaign?
No, I think they expected this sort of thing, and Hillary Clinton's team actually issued a statement minutes after Donald Trump concluded and essentially said it was a very negative, nasty speech spreading fear. They're using that term, instead of building walls, that Americans should build bridges. So what you're going to see is an attempt by the campaign in Philadelphia, the Democratic Party, to try and be much more positive about America's future. They kind of have to be, because Hillary Clinton is running on the coattails of President Barack Obama here in the US. And of course, they have to back his policies. But they've got facts a little bit on their side. The economy has been improving dramatically since the 2008 recession. Despite all the headlines, streets are safer here in the United States. In fact, killing a policeman generally over a period of time is down. Now, there have been pockets of poverty. There have been pockets of underemployment, especially among working class whites, which is where Donald Trump is getting a lot of his support. I think the difference between the two campaigns is going to be so stark this time, and the rhetoric, though, is going to be extremely nasty indeed. The Democrats feel they have enough to build a grand coalition, a bit like they did under Barack Obama, with college-educated whites, Latinos, African Americans, also women because of Donald Trump's stance there, whereas the Republican Party will have about 40% guaranteed of generally white population living in the South and the middle of the country outside of the urban areas. The big question is, can they get other voters, that 20% in the middle? And nasty campaigns don't normally get people to the polls. It's going to be very, very interesting to see.